Hi, Misha here, and really I just felt like doing something fun, and those who know me know how much I find Japanese stuff, World War II, but World War I and Cold War II, just interesting. It's a very different design aesthetic. That doesn't mean I'm like pro or against, it's interesting as a study to me. So, in this video, which is kind of another one of my model and gun videos, I wanted to talk about the Japanese Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy. The rifles that were made especially for them, the handguns they used during World War I, World War II, and for the model component, talk about the 4 fleet carriers that were there for the Battle of Midway, June 1942. We've got Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu. These are the 4 fleet carriers that were there. 4 out of the 6 that were in service at the time. There was also Shokoku and Zuikoku, but they were not available for Midway. Those are the 6 that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack. These are the 4 at Midway, turning point of the war. These are 1,100 scale die-cast ship models from Eagle Moss. And just kind of an overview. I thought that'd be a neat place to start to kind of put the guns in perspective. This is kind of a fun primer. I will put links to the full videos on the pistols. We've got the original Nambu here, sometimes known as the Model 1902 Modified, or the Type 4, or the Papa. And then, of course, we have the standard Type 14 Nambu and the Type 94. As for our rifles, we have the Type 35, which is made for the Navy. Then we have the Type I, which again was made exclusively for the Navy. And then the Navy Special, made very much during World War II. So I will link to pistols and rifles, more complete videos in the description. And if you find talking about aircraft carriers or warships interesting, there will be a longer, more detailed video on these and other Japanese Navy carriers over on my personal channel as a kind of companion. So you can check that out if you want to. I don't know, guys, just having fun in this nice spring weekend, frankly. So with that, we'll get into it. Our first rifle is actually one that's a bit of a footnote in history, but it was a very important step. This is the Type 35 Arasaka, although perhaps it should be called the Type 35 Nambu. The Army had the first smokeless powder in the Murata Type 22, which was quickly followed up by the Arasaka Type 30 and its new 6.5mm cartridge. The Arisaka was very much inspired by early Mausers as well as the German commission rifle and a few other things. This was for the Army, and production was pretty much dedicated to them from 1897, when it was adopted, up till about 1904, 1905. Now, of course, there was the Russo-Japanese War, as well as other things, and the Navy really needed one of those newfangled smokeless powder guns. And so they went to the Tokyo Arsenal to see what was cooking. Now, Arasaka had started the design, but an up-and-coming young feller named Kaijiro Nambu took the original Type 30 and and introduced some changes and several product improvements. So when the Navy was there in 1902, they were shown the Type 35 here, and quickly would order some. And these were built between 1902 and 1904. We don't know exactly how many, but it was not a huge number, around 10,000. And it does differ in several noteworthy ways from the Type 30. For one, we have a new adjustable rear sight. We have a new upper handguard to go with it. We still fire the 6.5 by 50 semi-rimmed cartridge. We still take the same Type 30 bayonet. We still have the same 30-inch barrel, sling swivels, internal 5-round magazine, although they did change the spring from a coil type to more of a leaf type. Flat butt plate, standard cocking handle, what have you. They did enlarge the hook safety on the Type 30, which in some ways I like better on the 35, and other ways I don't, because it will pinch your finger. And they introduced this dust cover. One of the lessons they learned during the Russo-Japanese War and other things kind of happening over in China in the late 19th and very early 20th centuries, a dust cover was kind of important. Now, of course, later, the Arasaka would have an automatic cover, but this was the first effort, so it's actually manual. It's spring-loaded here, slide it forward, and it locks forward. And if you recognize that cover, it was also used on the so-called Siamese Mauser, the Type 46, and so on. These are the only two guns that actually used it, though. Beyond that, this uses the same basic bolt system as the Type 30, but it does have a larger, more aggressive extractor and an updated ejector. Like I said, the magazine feed was updated. Little changes like that. So it's just had several product improvements, but it did have a few shortcomings too. For one, while this rear sight is pretty easy to adjust, the spring, the way it's done, can crack and break. It's also not terribly durable if you hit it from above. For another, this dust cover, while better than nothing, you can see where different errors can crop in. And this whole bolt system, kind of derived from the commission rifle and very early Mausers, while a good first effort, technology had progressed on. It was an interim solution, truth be told. But it was the Navy's gun. Whereas the Army had the Type 30, the Navy had something a little bit better. And these were used by shore guards, and they were used by what would become the Naval Special Landing Service, essentially Marines in World War II. And they were kept on board ships' lockers for defense. Think about it. If you're on a ship, maybe fighting another ship or at shore, having a long-range gun has some assets. And the 6.5 cartridge is actually known for being quite flat shooting and all of that. It's a neat gun, and while production would end by 1905, these would stay in the Navy frontline use up to World War I, but they would be phased out during that war and after. Although, parts of these would reemerge at the end of World War II in what we call today the Type 02 45, or what I like to call the substitute Type 35. But that's a story for another video. You can check out a link for that. This is definitively a Navy gun, so I had to talk about it. Our first sidearm, our first handgun, is Nambu's first pistol. Well, technically, a modification of it, as the name would suggest. In 1902, he first unveiled what was really just known as the Model 1902, or the Nambu pistol. Today, we call it the Grandpa Nambu. It fired a new 8x22 bottlenecked cartridge was striker fired, single recoil spring, 8-round magazine with about a 4.7-inch barrel. It had adjustable sights and a wooden shoulder stock as standard. That was kind of a thing back then at the turn of the 20th century. Think about the broom handle Mauser, even the Luger pistol. The Grandpa, as it was known, was only produced in very small numbers because it was a first attempt. It very quickly gave way to the Papa, as we know it, which was being shown off as early as 1904 and 1905. It was almost the same gun, but with several key refinements. For one, the trigger guard was enlarged. Yeah, if you think this is small, the Grandpa was even smaller. Also, the magazine went from having a wooden base plate to kind of an alloy metal one. And several small design refinements were made. The modified 1902, the Papa Nambu, was originally also offered with the shoulder stock, so it still had the adjustable rear sight. It was known as the Nambu pistol, or ironically, the Army pistol. And the Army did trial these, but never officially adopted it or placed any major orders. At this time, though, the Japanese officer would purchase his own sidearm, so it was an option. The Navy, however, became interested a little before World War I. Around 1907, 1908, they were looking for a new sidearm. Now, the 1926 revolver, double-action 9mm revolver, was standard in the Army, along with some other designs, but it was not ideal for the Navy's purposes. So they looked at the Nambu pistol and placed an initial order in 1909 for 1,500. So ironically, even though this is referred to as the Army-type pistol, it was actually officially adopted and ordered by the Navy. And during World War I, a second order for 2,500 was placed, so about 4,000. It's uncertain if all 4,000 were delivered to the Navy. Some sources say a few maybe weren't, maybe 3,700 were delivered. And again, several hundred were sent to the Army via private purchase. All told, we don't really know how many were built. They either came from the Tokyo Arsenal or Tokyo Gas and Electric. And while primary production would end around 1923 with the Great Kanto earthquake, some would still be assembled from existing parts throughout the 1920s, plus older guns would be refurbished. So numbers range anywhere from under 9,000 to as many as 10,300 built. It was pretty evenly split between the two manufacturers for the full size. Now today, this is an old design, but for its day and time, it was actually quite an effective automatic pistol. Have this grip safety up front. There's no manual safety. Checkered wood grips. These were made from very nice blued machined parts. I should point out that the first batch sent to the Navy still had the stock slot. They decided very soon they didn't want that, so that it was filled in, and then later guns did not have it. But they still retained the adjustable rear sight. They also had a movable lanyard loop. Striker fired, pretty good trigger, 8-round magazine, last round hold open on the mag but no device. The 8mm cartridge this fired was, it was more powerful than say 9mm Glycinti, but not near as powerful as 9mm Parabellum or 45 or any of that stuff, so it was kind of in between. Again, we only have one guide spring rod system here, and it's asymmetric. It's on the side, which is a little unusual. And these were pretty expensive to build, but for a first effort, not bad. That primarily served with the Navy, but Army too. And even though production was over by the 1930s, these were still very much in inventory and use and were being refurbished and reworked throughout World War II, and several would be bring back guns. If you have one today, I would not advise shooting it because replacement parts are not easy to come by. And again, these were kind of worked to fire the original 8mm cartridge, which was a different loading than used in World War II. But yeah, this is very identifiable as a Navy pistol, and it was the beginning of the whole Nambu series. For our first model, we're going to start a little bit out of order in some ways. The carrier Kaga. This was actually Japan's third carrier to go into service and second fleet carrier. But this model is from 1932, so in its original configuration. Kaga started life as a Tosa-class battleship, laid down in 1920 and first launched at the end of 1921. However, 1922, Japan signed the Washington Naval Treaty, which put a lot of limitations on overall tonnage for battleships and carriers and what have you. But it did allow for the signatories to convert 2 battlecruiser hulls or 2 battleship hulls into carriers. So Japan selected Akagi and Amagi to be converted. These are still under construction, and they would be Japan's first fleet carriers. Now, its very first aircraft carrier was Hosho, which was coming into service around this time. But it was a small carrier, only carrying about 15 aircraft. But, you gotta start somewhere. So, yeah, Akagi and Amagi were to be the carriers, but in 1923 there was that great Kanto earthquake, which damaged Amagi's hull. Could it have been repaired? Maybe, but Kaga's hull was just there. So they decided that year to make it the new carrier, and so they scrapped Amagi. But it would take a while for work to begin because of the cleanups and everything else. So finishing her out, they really didn't begin until 1925, and she was officially commissioned to begin sea trials in 1928, and she would join the fleet fully in service at the end of 1929. Now this model here is from 1932. Her first major mission, along with Hosho, was sent to Chinese waters for the Shanghai incident, and in February of that year, her aircraft would engage, actually an American flying Allied aircraft, but there would be air fighting, and this would start to teach a lot. But in this configuration, she wouldn't last long. She is about 800 meters, original top speed of about 27 knots, and original weight of about 27 tons light, up to 34 tons fully loaded. Interestingly, she has 3 flight decks, a large one on top, which is about 560 feet, a tiny one in the middle, which is under 50 feet, and then a medium one at front, which is about 180 feet. And the 2 forward ones, they reminds me of like a cake, but in here it actually goes straight into hangar area, so planes could take off straight from the hangars and fly out. That was the idea, leaving the top deck for landing. She didn't have catapults. She used a transverse arrestor gear system. She did have an armored hull, and she did have 8-inch guns for surface defense, as well as 5-inch dual-purpose guns. At this time, in America too, they really weren't sure aircraft carriers could defend themselves, so they were giving them guns. So she would start off with some 8-inchers. She would carry about 60 aircraft. Her early flight groups were about 28 bombers, dive or torpedo. Well, early on, just be torpedo. 16 fighters, and 16 scout/reconnaissance planes. And she originally had a crew of about 1,350. But it was very clear that this was a dated design, and so it was slated for reconstruction and to be refit before Akagi. So in 1933, it would go in for the said refit, which would last until 1935. By 1936, Kaga would look very much like Akagi that we're about to look at. With a smooth deck, they essentially plated over the smaller ones, turning her into more hangar space, giving her more fuel storage. She was able to carry up to 72 airplanes ready to go, plus 8 or 9 more in storage. She actually could have a total of about 90 planes, including spares, all on board. They would rework her engines, giving her a new top speed of almost 29 knots. They would rework her funnels, giving her new equipment. And her crew would jump to over 1,700, and her tonnage would jump to over 38,000, which, by the way, was more than the Washington Naval Treaty allowed, but by 1936, most aren't really giving a damn. And there would be multiple other things, including removing some of her gun batteries, adding more air defense, because in the beginning it was pretty light. And this really helped with fleet doctrine they were practicing. Her sister would go in for her own refit a short time later, but in 1937, Kaga would go to China for the Second Sino-Japanese War, and she would serve there quite intensively throughout that year in 1938, going in for brief resupply and refit occasionally, and updating her aircraft as technology improved. And then in 1939-40, she would go in for another major update. This was more for equipment, for example, on the bridge. She would also end up getting new aircraft like the A6M, the very famous Zero, as well as the B5N, the Kate, and the D3A, so bombers and all that. By this point, her air group is increasing. She's got more space. And in April of 1941, the Japanese Fleet Command pretty much roll all of its carriers into one group. This was offensively very aggressive and very forward-thinking. At this time, most other nations were separating their carriers. Early on, they considered the carrier to be a support for battleship and a way to take out enemy battleships, later enemy carriers. But now they're thinking more offensively, grouping them together, and letting their combat air patrols, their CAPs, support each other. And from there, the modernized Kaga would join her sister ships and start training for what would become the attack on Pearl Harbor. In November, they would join up, they would take on supplies, and they would leave port by the end of that month. And of course, having their rendezvous with destiny on December 7. Planes from Kaga would hit many battleships, including Nevada, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and yes, Pennsylvania, as well as destroying multiple aircraft on the ground. And her losses would be quite light, and afterwards she would return to friendly waters for a resupply and what have you. So it was quite a success for her. But like I said, this model is quite neat because it's in the early Shanghai incident configuration, still featuring biplanes. It's a very interesting look for the carrier. But again, it wouldn't last very long. Here she is, Akagi. This was the flagship of the First Air Fleet before enduring Pearl Harbor, and often served as the command ship, at least for the carrier groups. Originally, she was laid down also in 1920 as part of the Japanese buildup post-World War I as a battle cruiser, an Amagi class battle cruiser. So she was designed to be faster than Kaga, but Kaga had more armor. As already explained, of course, construction was halted when Japan signed the Naval Treaty, and after the Kanto earthquake, conversion began, turning her into a carrier at the end of 1923, so she underwent that much earlier than Kaga. And really, preliminary work was over by 1925, and she was commissioned into the fleet in March of 1927, and she would start working up that year, and was ready to go by 1928, becoming the second carrier in the Japanese fleet and the first true fleet carrier. She looked very much like Kaga over there. She had a longer top deck. Kaga's deck was about 560 feet. Akagi's was about 625, but the two smaller decks were the same. She carried about the same number of aircraft, but she was faster at over 32 knots because, again, she started off as a battlecruiser. And she was about the same weight overall, 27 light up to 34 fully laden before her refit. Since Kaga was more archaic, she would go in, and Akagi here would kind of be the main fleet for exercise, the main carrier for exercises in the 1930s. I should point out that in 1929, she was captained for a year by one Admiral, well, at the time Captain Yamamoto. Kind of an interesting little footnote. Anyway, after Kaga went through her rebuild, Akagi here would go in 1935, but it would actually take through 1938 to get it done. Even though the work was far less, they had less to do, it took much longer, partially just because of money and financing at the time. But eventually she would come out, and then she would relieve Kaga in Chinese waters in 1939, taking on board newer aircraft and taking part in various incidents there. 1940, she too would go in for some minor refitting, and April 1941, she would be assigned to the 1st Air Fleet and would be made the flagship. And so we'll start training up, working as carriers as a group, and again, working for Pearl Harbor towards that, taking on supplies from September to November, leaving port towards the end of that month, and attacking on December 7. With the same B5Ns, D3As supported by A6M0s. She too would attack several battleships, including Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, as well as the airfield at Pearl Harbor, and various tankers, and planes would even shoot down a B-7. As I was saying before being interrupted, planes from Akagi shot down a B-17. She launched multiple waves and suffered very light losses. At this time, she had a crew of about 1,650, so a little less than Kaga. She was a little bit longer, although Kaga would be stretched out at some points. She had a flight deck of about 850 feet, over 100 feet wide, and of course she had 8-inch guns initially, but these would be removed during the refit. During the refit, because of added weight, she would get over 40 tons. Her speed would actually dip below 32 knots, about 31 and a half knots, but the trade-off was several other things. After Pearl Harbor, she would kind of make her way back, but would support various operations when and where she was needed, moving into 1942. Our next rifle, the Type I, also fires 6.5 by 50 semi-rimmed, 6.5 millimeter Arasaka, and it too, like the Type 35, is a naval classic made for the Navy. But this one has a very neat history, and for a long time was kind of looked down upon, because this was created in Italy for the Japanese Navy. So Carcano collectors kind of looked at it as well, this isn't a real Carcano. And Japanese collectors, well, it wasn't made in Japan. It didn't have the really cool mum on it. Didn't have a dust cover. Didn't have AA sights. So for a long time, it kind of fell in between the cracks. So you could pick these up, and sometimes very nice shape. But this is a neat story. In the 1930s, the Navy and Army fought for resources, and it went both ways. While the Navy had plenty of steel to build ships, they did not have access to a lot of rifles. Conversely, the Army had access to a lot of rifles, but they did not actually have enough steel to build a lot of tanks. Yeah. So realizing that Japanese arsenals could not give them new guns when they needed them to equip new ships as they were coming online, the Navy contracted with Italy, part of the Axis, and in 1937 they started producing the Type I. This was designed by Terni in Italy and produced by them too, as well as Beretta and a couple of other state arsenals. And it really is a Carcano worked with Japanese features. It's a Carcano bolt system, kind of a hybrid sight, very much a Carcano trigger, Carcano safety, Arisaka style magazine, hybrid stock, two-piece though, kind of like a Arisaka, and it takes the Type 30 bayonet. It's neat. It's all made in Italy, but they took features from Japan as needed to make them compatible. And the main deliveries were between 1937 and 1939, with the final ones delivered via submarine in 1941. After that time, it was kind of impossible, and Italy's position had changed. How many of these were built? Some sources say 60,000. Some say 120,000. I tend to lean more towards the 60,000, just based on observed serials, but could be wrong. So, not a tiny contract, but not huge either. And the Navy would issue these throughout. They would go to the Special Landing Forces quite a bit. They were actually well liked and used as kind of DMRs because some felt them to be a little more accurate than the Arasaka. At least the Arisakas the Navy had, because they might have been older ones kind of getting worn out. These are brand new guns. Part of it too was that they were a bit heavier. The wood is a hardwood stock. So they would also be used by shore guards. They would be used on board ships, put in lockers for defense and what have you. This is why some of these are in excellent condition today. The only real variation of note, aside from the different manufacturers, is length of stock. There are two basic lengths, a shorter and a longer. And no one really knows for sure exactly why. Different stories abound. It doesn't really matter. That's the main difference here. But these are very high quality guns for what they were. Maybe a little plain looking. But when the Navy could not get Arisakas from Japanese arsenals, they got them from Italy. And flipping over the Type I. I encourage you to check this one out. They're pretty darn neat. Because of their extra weight and their long barrel, yeah, they were thought to be a little more accurate. Hard to say for sure, but they certainly weren't known for being inaccurate. The trigger is your typical Carcano style trigger, but that's fine. Of course, again, the standard Arasaka box magazine. Standard steel cleaning rod. Non-protected front sight. Basic notch rear. Short upper handguard. So for a time, this helped the Navy out and gave them tens of thousands of new guns to combine with their existing Arisakas, and they still would get some Type 38s and 99s from arsenals, and you can usually tell the ones for the Navy. Some will have an anchor, others will have this kind of black paint finish over the blue. If you see a black painted Arisaka, chances are it were Navy. So that's kind of where things were 1940, 41, towards the beginning of the war. But yeah, check out the Type I. Really cool, and I guess it does show you that the Axis powers could cooperate. The famous Type 14, usually referred to as the Nambu pistol. This was the most mass-produced pistol that Japan had, building upwards of 280,000, with production lasting, at least on paper, for upwards of 20 years. Built by 5 different factories. And while it's credited to Nambu, he really didn't have final say on the design. During World War I, around 1916, he started working on improving his Papa Nambu, sometimes also referred to as a Type 4, trying to make it more durable, more reliable, and more powerful. He would continue this work for about 8 years, but then he would retire from the military. So for the last 2 years, 1924-25, a committee, including some of his understudies, would finish out the design, and it would be officially adopted late in 1925, hence the name Type 14 for the 14th year of the reign of the Emperor Tosho. So what did they do? Some of the changes were very much good. They went away from the single recoil spring to a dual spring, which allowed them to adopt a hotter 8x22 cartridge. Still not as powerful as 9mm. It was certainly better than 380, and it was actually very accurate. Also helping with the accuracy, this is still striker fired and has a very superb trigger. They also refined disassembly a bit, and they added a safety, this manual catch up here. But it's a little bit awkward, and if it seems like it was kind of shoehorned into the design after the fact, it's because that's exactly what happened. But they did get rid of the grip safety. And they simplified construction and what have you, including having fixed rear sights because, no shoulder stock. This started to be fielded in the late 20s in small numbers and in larger numbers throughout the 1930s, first used by the Army, but eventually they would start to filter into the Navy as well. There would be a great recall in 1932 to add a magazine disconnect safety because issues. They would also rework the firing pin. The striker system was kind of a double-edged sword. It did allow it to be easy to fire, light, but it was not the strongest. The springs would wear out, and the firing pins were known for breaking. They would improve it throughout production, but never really get it perfect. And then in the late 30s, they would introduce this larger trigger guard for better use with winter gloves. And they would introduce this secondary magazine spring because soldiers were dropping mags because originally it was totally drop-free. So it started off drop-free, something Americans love, but ended up not being. And throughout the war, of course, simplifications would be made. At the beginning of the war, officers still purchased their guns, but NCOs did not. If they needed a sidearm, it was issued. And by 1943, guns started to be issued, and that's really when the Type 14 went into mass production. I actually picked this one out of my collection because it was produced shortly before Pearl Harbor happened. So, a good example. These had a 4.7-inch barrel, overall length of over 9 inches, but it's actually quite svelte because a lot of that, and it has a very nice thin grip. It actually feels very good in the hand, and while these are not known for utter durability, dependability, they are known for accuracy and shooting comfort. They are a lot of fun to shoot, believe it or not. And it made a good service gun for Japan. Not perfect, but it's not near as bad as kind of some in history want to make it out to be. But of course, in Japan, pistols were secondary weapons. intended for self-defense or simply a badge of rank. And the Nambu is no exception here. Production would continue right up until the end of the war, although in greatly diminished capacities. But again, I've done several buying guide on these, so you can check those out if interested. It is a really cool piece of history, and for a long time you could pick these up for a song. Now they're starting to get a little more respect, but for a time they were kind of everywhere and very few people wanted them. They were a sleeper. We next come to the Imperial Japanese Navy's true first purpose-built aircraft carrier. Although, to be sneaky, they tried passing it off as a flight deck cruiser to skirt the Washington Treaty, but yeah, it didn't work. This is Soryu. Along with her half-sister, Hiryu, they were ordered in the 1931-1932 fiscal year, and she was laid down in 1934, and her hull was launched in 1935. And she would be commissioned into the fleet at the end of 1937. And this model here is of her first cruise in 1938. So she still has biplanes on board. This was originally designed under the strictures of the Naval Treaty, although since they were pretty much done with it by the time she was in service, yeah. Interestingly, it's a cruiser-type hull. In fact, it uses the same engines as the Mogami class cruisers. So, when commissioned, this was the fastest aircraft carrier in the world at over 34 knots, 34.5 knots on trials even. Nominal weight was about 16,500 tons. Loaded up, it got over 19,000. Honestly, it was almost as long as Kaga at about 774 feet, but it was much more narrow, under 70 feet wide at the hull, and the flight deck at certain points would stretch out to 100, but only a little bit. So, almost as long, and we had a flight deck of over 700 feet, so that's, good too. But, little different. They didn't have quite the same, they didn't put 8-inch guns on her. She wasn't really armored. She had an operational flight group of about 61 planes, so almost as much as the larger carriers, but she did not carry near as many spares. That's kind of where that led off. Her crew was around 1,100 nominal. Of course, that would go up as the war would go. But yeah, Soryu was the first of her type, and really would be the first true Japanese built from the ground up aircraft carrier, and it would pretty much inspire everything else to come throughout the war. Her first cruise in 1938 would be to support operations in China, although she saw very light combat. It was essentially an extended shakedown cruise anyway. She would go back to port in 1939 and would go to support operations in the invasion of Indochina in 1940. And she would go in for a little bit of an update. She would be assigned to the 1st Air Fleet in April of 1941. Then she would actually be detached that summer to again support operations around Indochina. She would come back in August of 41 for a minor refit, and she was ready to start training up for the attack in October. So she would get a few minor updates, but mostly to her aircraft. And she would be there on December 7, launching the usual and attacking various targets. After Pearl Harbor, she actually would go support the offense to take Wake Island, which would surrender on December 22nd. And then after that operation, she would return to home waters to resupply. moving into 1942 like the rest of them. But it's an interesting carrier. It holds quite a lot, but it does have a lot of compromises for speed and weight. A little less range, a little less fuel than the bigger ones, so you can tell where they had to cut to make it work. But it was much more modern, using much more modern ideas of how aircraft and aircraft carriers should be used. And she directly led to her half-sister, as historians call it. But we'll get to her in a minute. Initially, Hiryu was supposed to be the same class and type as Soryu. But there was an incident known as the Fourth Fleet Incident, in which Japanese ships were caught out in the ocean by a major typhoon, and it really showed the deficiencies of a lot of weight up top, relative instabilities, so there was kind of a rush to rework the entire fleet. Soryu was well underway, so there was little that could be done, but Hiryu was not yet officially laid down, so the design was modified rather hastily. It was laid down in the summer of 1936, launched in November of 37, and commissioned into the fleet in July 1939. The major difference is it received more armor, so more weight down below, overall just heavier. It was slightly wider by about 4 feet. The forecastle was changed a bit. The tower was switched from the starboard to the port side, kind of interesting. And overall, she was just a heavier vessel meant to withstand seas a bit more. She was about 17,500 tons light and about 20,500 tons loaded up. So about 1,000 more than Soryu. She was obviously in the fleet later. She carried a couple of extra planes, a total of 64 plus spares. Same as before, same top speed. In fact, she was right there in there with Soryu when commissioned. Overall, the same length of just about 750 feet, and had a flight deck of about 710 feet. Yeah, same basic operations, plus they tried to update the air defense with 40mm and 25mm guns, trying to be a little more modern. And she had a crew of 1,100. So after working up, she would be sent on detachment to help the invasion of French Indochina, and would operate alongside Soryu quite a bit, and then be assigned to the fleet. In fact, she was part of the 2nd Division. It would be the flagship of the 2nd Division of the 1st Air Fleet. Again, supporting operations in the summer of 1941. Hiryu would go in for a minor refit in August, just like Soryu. Kind of, they would change back and forth, and would prepare for Pearl Harbor. Now, her time at Pearl Harbor was not quite as successful because her targets were supposed to be the aircraft carriers. They were not there. Her secondary target was the battleship USS Pennsylvania, which was also not there. So in the end, they just kind of went over whatever targets of opportunity they could find, and battleships and whatnot. It should be said that at aircraft from Hiryu was credited with delivering the killing blow to the USS Arizona that detonated her magazine. So there is that. And like Soryu, Hiryu would be kind of diverted to Wake Island after Pearl Harbor to help assault and help support the landings there on December 22nd, 23rd, and ultimately lead to the surrendering of the island, and eventually would make her way back home for resupply before heading back out again as 1942 rolled on. So at this point in time, things are looking up for the Japanese carriers, to be sure. Moving deeper into the war, we come to our final rifle today, the Type 99 Naval Special, or Special Navy Rifle. And this isn't special as in select or high grade. This is special as in the bus it rides is a little bit shorter than the rest. Like I said, the Type I supplied the Navy in 1930s and into the early 1940s. But after suffering losses and the naval landing forces having to engage the Allies 1942-43, by 1944 they were again running out of guns, and again the arsenals really didn't have leftover capacity. They were running out of everything. So they actually tasked their own manufacturers who basically were working for shipyards like Yokosuka to make a version of the Type 99 as cheap as possible. So they turned to the trainer type guns. Now these weren't really built with training parts, more of the idea behind the training parts. Therefore, we have cast iron everywhere possible. Cast iron butt plate. We even have a cast iron cocking handle. We have a cast iron trigger guard. Very simple wood. We have a cast iron front sight. It does have a protector. Later that would go away. And we have an adjustable cast iron rear sight. Later that would become a fixed rear sight. And, as I'm sure you know, we have a cast iron receiver. Ta-da! Special. So yeah, this is not using critical steel. It's using much easier to get and melt down cast iron. Kind of makes you wonder if some cooking pots and stuff were not used to make these. And the wood was kind of whatever wood they could come by. Like the standard Type 99 short rifle, this had a barrel a little under 26 inches, although a carbine version was built towards the end, not because they wanted a carbine so much as they could save steel even more. But these were produced and delivered to the Navy in 1944 and in the earlier part of 1945. No one knows for sure exactly how many were turned out, but I've seen a number of about 6,000 bantered about, so take it as you will. Flipping our special one over, it still has a bayonet lug, cast of course, but it does not have sling swivels, not even rope holes. These are just meant to have a rope looped around them and used that way. Now the safety is even cast iron. The bolt head is steel, but further back, like I said, the charging handle is cast iron. And you'll notice the pock marks in the receiver here. Those are just inclusions from the casting. To make this work, you'll notice the step. Boop, boop. That's because, much like a modern AR-15, this steel barrel has an extension that goes into the receiver. And so the bolt lugs, which are steel, lock into the barrel extension, which is steel. So it is steel on steel lockup, and kind of like with an AR that uses an alloy receiver to hold it all together, this uses the cast iron. Notice the step there. That said, I would not shoot one of these days. They were nominally safe to fire with the 7.7 by 58 back then. And again, this one here is actually an earlier one. Later, they would get more last-ditch features, simplified rear sight. They would get the shortened upper handguard to save wood. They would delete the sight protectors. You know the drill by now for the last-ditch guns. This is a relatively early one, as it were. These are often mistaken for trainers, so you can sometimes find one for a pretty good deal. But if someone knows what they have, they tend to sell for quite a bit, just because of what they are, and namely what they are not. But this was the last major gun made for the Japanese, again mostly used by the Naval Special Landing Forces, and of course used to defend the home islands, including Okinawa and all that towards the end. There would be some true last-ditch guns like the aforementioned Type 0245, and of course plenty of just standard Type 99s and substitute 99s as well. But this one was all the navies so they could take as much pride in it as they would want. It's a cool piece of collectible history, though. I'll give it that. I really do like it for that. I'm really happy to have one. Plus, it has a neat little anchor on the receiver. These shouldn't have mums, they're just anchors. And there we have the Japanese Navy rifles. And for our final sidearm today, and really one of the last designs to go into production in Japan, the Type 94, also credited to Kaijiro Nambu. He would design this after he retired. In 1927, he opened up his own factory, and he designed this. There's a little bit of a debate as to for whom, but I tend to say it was for the Japanese, because they needed something for mechanized crews. In 1933, 34, 35, they were adopting newer aircraft, newer tanks, newer other vehicles, and they were becoming truly a mechanized military. And the 14 was not ideal for being in the cramped confines of a vehicle, and Japanese vehicles were very cramped. So the Type 94, first shown off in 1934 for the 2294th year in the Japanese calendar, tried to address the issues of the 14 and tried to be better for vehicle crews. In a lot of ways, it succeeded. It's maligned today, but it's rather unfair mostly. This has a much shorter barrel at about 3.7 inches, and overall it's quite a bit shorter at a little over 7 inches. It's lighter too, of course, but since it still is all steel, not a heck of a lot. It's machine steel, of course. It uses synthetic grips, at least up until the end when they went back to wood. So pretty modern for that damn time. Fixed sights. Still fires the 8mm cartridge. We have a small 6-round magazine. Browning style release. No secondary retention, but it was made to not quite be totally drop free. Part of it was the angle. And whereas the Type 4 and 14 were striker fired, this is a hammer fired gun with a concealed internal hammer. And actually, it's a good thing. While the trigger is not near as nice, it's more reliable. It kind of eliminated the issue of the striker spring wearing out and really reduced firing pin breakage to an acceptable level. Still has a magazine disconnect safety. Unlike the 14, it was integrated into the design from the beginning, though. And it has a more reasonably placed safety right here for the thumb. So it's quite a bit smaller, a little bit lighter, more reliable. This was never meant to be a frontline battlefield gun. This was a self-defense gun for pilots, tank crews, artillerymen, maybe officers on a ship, what have you. And it was only produced at Nambu's factory. In the beginning, orders were very small, but of course they ramped up during World War II. They built a little over 70,000, 71, 72,000. So not a tiny number, but not massive. And production of these would only end just a little bit before the end of World War II, around June, maybe early July of 1945. But these would have definitely been carried by pilots especially, and I'm sure some others on board ship. Because as a carry gun, it's a lot more comfortable than the 14. Not as elegant, but it actually has a pretty comfy grip. Of course, you can't talk about the Type 94 and not talk about the whole suicide pistol, the whole sear thing. Here it is on the outside. I'm not going to go into it in detail. I've covered it before. The reason it's here is to make it compact. And other pistols do it too. And yes, if it is cocked, you can press in here. Now note, this is not sticking out. It is inside. So you have to press down in a very specific area. And it has to be with the safety off. If the safety is on, you can't, because physically it's blocking it. The Japanese carried these without one in the barrel, or if they had to have one in the barrel, it was always with safety on. And the whole thing about suicide pistols using it to surrender and all that, that's not going to happen. No American soldier would let a Japanese approach them with a pistol muzzle pointing towards them. Even if their finger was not on the trigger or near the trigger guard, no one's going to let someone surrender by pointing a pistol at them. That's obviously something that was made up after the war. It used to be a very commonly accepted wives' tale, but luckily, in modern times, we know it for what it is. But I had to talk about this because it is a really neat gun, and, for what it was, it did some things very well. And its shortcomings were, if not intentional, were known compromises that Nambu made to fit a size and weight requirement and to make the hammer system work. He knew what he was doing. And there are very few reports. There are more reports of the Type 14 injuring soldiers before the magazine disconnect safety was introduced than there are those hitting the sears on these and shooting themselves in the nads. But yeah, these are kind of the major Japanese Navy sidearms. So here we are lined up. 1942 started off quite good for the carriers. Their luck held. Soryu and Hiryu operated together most of January. Akagi and Kaga did their own thing, but they would meet up in February because on the 19th they would launch a successful assault on Darwin, Australia. It didn't lead to an invasion, but they did sink 8 ships and did some damage. From there they would go into the Indian Ocean raids, although Kaga would be peeled off. She had hit a reef earlier, temporarily repaired, but needed to go in for more major repairs, so it was Akagi and Soryu and Hiryu. And they would move on, eventually going to Java, helping that effort, and in April attacking Colombia. At this point, their idea is to kind of break the British fleet, and they would sink cruisers, and they would sink the HMS Hermes, a British carrier, although an old one. And so things are still looking quite good. A little damage here, a little damage there. They would put in for a little rest and repair and refit and be rejoined by Kaga, and then at the end of May they would leave for Midway Island. Because the U.S. carriers were not there at Pearl Harbor, they wanted to draw them out and finish them off. Now, the U.S. had lost Lexington, and Yorktown was damaged, and the Japanese had really only lost Shoho because of the events of the Coral Sea, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Shohoku and Zokiku were not available. One was damaged, the other one wasn't, so these were held back. So they only sent these 4 carriers to Midway. But that should have been enough because America only had 3 carriers with 1 of them damaged. But of course America also had Midway Island. It's a thing, you can read all about it. And as you know, this is where the tables, they do a turnin'. At first, from about 7 a.m. till 9 a.m., things were still going in the Japanese favor. Most American assaults were fruitless, but they were wearing the Japanese down. Because there were problems with Japanese operations of their carriers. They had good offensive punch, but their radio communications were poor. Their radar was substandard. Their anti-air was substandard, either the guns or their combat air patrol, because it was a little light. They didn't really have armor, and their fire suppression was less than ideal. So the Americans were wearing them down. So really between 10:20 and 10:30 that morning, 3 out of the 4 carriers would end up mortally wounded. The hardest hit was Kaga. She was hit by 3 500-pound bombs and a 1,000-pound bomb. Did a lot of damage and actually killed over 800 crew, the most of any fatalities. Next was Soryu. She was hit multiple times by 3,000-pound bombs directly, plus near misses. And actually, for her size, considering she had less crew, her ratio of loss was even higher because she would lose over 700 men. It was bad. These were the 2 that were really targeted. Interestingly, Akagi wasn't initially targeted, but a few planes decided, you know what, she looks lonely. They peeled off, and all of their bombs missed or were near misses, except for one little old 1,000-pounder that just happened to hit just right and penetrated and set her ablaze too. So while at first it might seem recoverable, in the end it was not. Of course, this didn't all happen immediately. None of them would sink right away, but they would catch flame uncontrollably. The crews would be taken off, and at various times they would be ordered to be scuttled with torpedoes throughout the afternoon. That left Hiryu, who was the lucky one out of the bunch. While her sisters were being bombarded, she got away more or less scot-free and would continue operations, sending out several waves that afternoon, and would ultimately end up sinking the USS Yorktown, or planes rather. And she would continue operations into 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock that afternoon. And at first her luck really held up until about 5:30 when it finally ran out. And as she was essentially retreating, or at least maneuvering away for another attack later on, she was finally hit. Now at this point her air group had suffered quite heavy losses, although she took some planes on board from her ill-fated sister ships. But in the end, she were sunk too. Well, eventually. They kind of fought it throughout the night. There were fires, there were things, but she would continue on throughout the night even though they would take crew off. It would not be until after 9 a.m. the next day, June 5th, that she would finally go down. So she was a stubborn ship, which makes sense. She was the youngest and in some ways most modern. And so it went from a situation of the Japanese having 6 fleet carriers, the Americans having 3, to the Japanese having 2 fleet carriers compared with America's 2 operational. Much better odds. But it was just the giant blow. Like I said, Kaga and Soryu would lose together over 1,500 men, and the other ships would lose, give or take, 300. So it was pretty devastating. Over 2,000 sailors lost. Not to mention all the planes and many trained crews and quite a bit of the high command. A lot of captains and even an admiral or 2. It wasn't the immediate turning point that history makes it out to be. It took time, but it leveled the playing field and it started the turn. That would happen later on, and that's a subject for another day. But if you like talking about these and you're enjoying these little models, again, check out my personal channel where I'm doing an expanded version talking about other carriers like Hosho and Teiho and Junyo. All fun stuff because they're all kind of very colorful. But the Japanese really did push carrier operations forward. The thing is, what they started, America would end with the Essex class. So there's that. And we end where we begin. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really helps out, especially these historical videos that are of limited interest, I know. But this is what's a lot of fun to me about firearms. I get to learn and put them in perspective. You know, we can look at models of fighter planes or ships or even tanks, and they're neat. But these rifles and pistols were really there, or at least were in the Pacific at the time. They're true relics. And sometimes with these Japanese guns, since the majority are vet bringbacks, most of them really were at one battle or another. And that's just really cool to me. I've done 101 kind of guide introduction videos talking about the variations and whatnot. So again, links in the description if you're interested. And if you do find other military hardware interesting, yeah, go over and check out my my personal channel. I've covered lots of Japanese ships, aircraft, and even some tanks. It's just something you don't hear talked a lot about, and I just enjoy learning. So again, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.